At 3:15 a.m., I walked into the living room. My fiancée was on the couch, whispering into the phone, "Don't wake him." Then she froze when she saw me. It was 3:15 in the morning when I woke up without knowing why. The apartment was dark, silent, too silent for a place where two people lived together. I reached across the bed and felt only cold sheets. My fiancée wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe she had gone to the kitchen for water or was watching television because of insomnia, something that happened now and then. But then I heard it. A faint whisper, almost like someone trying to smother a secret with their voice. I slipped quietly from the bed and followed the sound down the hallway. The living room door was slightly ajar, and a thin strip of light spilled across the floor. I pushed it open. There she was, curled up on the couch with her phone pressed to her ear. I caught the words clearly, "Don't wake him." My feet froze where I stood. Her body stiffened at the same moment. She turned her head, and for an instant her face looked as if she had been caught committing something criminal. She ended the call in a rush, fumbling as though the phone had turned into a burning coal. Then she looked at me with wide eyes, her lips forming an excuse before I even asked. She said something about calling her cousin who lived abroad, about different time zones, about not wanting to disturb my sleep. The explanation sounded rehearsed, too fast, too eager to fill the silence. But what unsettled me more wasn't her story. It was the details. On the coffee table in front of her were 2 glasses of wine. One was half empty, the other barely touched. I had not been drinking with her. She noticed where my eyes had landed and quickly picked up one of the glasses, pretending to sip from it, as if that would erase the evidence. The whole room smelled faintly of her perfume, but stronger than usual, like she had reapplied it recently. The television remote lay untouched on the side table. No Netflix, no late-night comedy reruns, nothing that would justify sitting awake at that hour. I didn't confront her immediately. Years of dealing with people at work had taught me that sometimes silence was more effective than accusations. Instead, I asked calmly why she hadn't just gone to bed. She repeated her story about the cousin, her words more defensive now, as if each sentence was a wall she was stacking between us. I nodded slowly, pretending to accept it, but inside, suspicion dug its claws in. When she finally walked back toward the bedroom, I lingered. I looked at the couch, the table, her phone still glowing faintly before it locked itself. And that was when I saw it. A name flashing briefly in the notification bar before disappearing. A name I didn't recognize. It wasn't her cousin. It wasn't a family member. And it definitely wasn't anyone she had ever mentioned. I followed her back to bed, but sleep was out of the question. My mind replayed the scene again and again. The whispered words. The second glass. The stranger's name. She fell asleep quickly, or at least pretended to, her breathing steady and deep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, piecing together possibilities. The next day, the atmosphere was strained. She acted as though nothing unusual had happened. She brewed coffee, checked her emails, even kissed me lightly on the cheek before heading out the door for work. But her cheerfulness felt forced, too deliberate, as though she was performing a role. I noticed something else. She carried her phone everywhere. She never left it on the counter while showering, never tossed it casually on the couch. It was glued to her hand, locked behind a new password I hadn't seen before. She had never been secretive with it in the past. We had been together long enough that there was no reason to hide. Or at least, there shouldn't have been. I kept quiet for now. Pressing her would only make her sharper, more careful. Instead, I started observing. That evening, when she said she was working late on a project, I checked the shared calendar she always updated. There was no such entry. When she returned home, she smelled faintly of smoke, though she had never smoked a cigarette in her life. At dinner, she laughed at something on her phone, then quickly locked the screen when I glanced over. I asked casually if her cousin had called again. She nodded too quickly, saying yes, then changed the subject. Suspicion grew heavier with every hour. But what disturbed me most wasn't just the possibility of infidelity. It was the sense that she was plotting something larger, something carefully concealed. I had the uneasy feeling that I had stumbled into the middle of a story whose first chapters had been hidden from me. A few nights later, I found another clue. She had fallen asleep on the couch with her phone still in her hand. While she slept, a notification appeared. It was from the same unfamiliar name I had glimpsed before. My pulse quickened. The message preview said only, "Tomorrow night, same place." The words rang in my ears. Same place. That implied repetition, routine. This wasn't a single mistake or a one-time coincidence. It was ongoing, and she had been confident enough to plan the next meeting. I didn't open the message. I didn't touch her phone. Instead, I memorized the time and the wording. If I played this right, I could discover everything without tipping her off. The following evening, she announced she would be staying late at the office again. She grabbed her coat, kissed me on the cheek, and hurried out the door. 15 minutes later, I followed. I drove carefully, far enough behind that she wouldn't notice. Her car wound through the city streets until it stopped outside a quiet cafe on the edge of town. I parked a block away, watching. She stepped inside, her posture nervous but expectant, like someone about to meet a confidant. A man arrived minutes later. Tall, sharp-featured, confident. He didn't look like a colleague. There was no laptop bag, no files. He slid into the seat across from her, and immediately they leaned close, speaking in low tones. I could only see them through the window, but their body language spoke volumes. She laughed at something he said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Bursting in now would give me nothing but denials and half-truths. Instead, I noted the time, the place, the man's appearance. Evidence mattered more than outrage. After about an hour, they left the cafe separately, but not before exchanging a look that wasn't professional, wasn't casual. She drove home directly afterward, where she once again performed the routine of a woman who had been at work all evening. When she entered the apartment, I acted normal. But every gesture she made, setting down her bag, asking how my day was, leaning in for a kiss, felt rehearsed, hollow, part of a script. That night, lying beside her, I knew the truth had only begun to surface. The whispered phone call at 3:15 a.m. had been the first crack in the mask. Now, with every action, every excuse, the mask was splintering further. And I realized something chilling. She wasn't just hiding an affair. She was hiding a plan. What kind of plan, I didn't know yet. But the way she guarded her phone, the way she coordinated meetings under the cover of late work, the way she erased traces but slipped up just enough to leave crumbs, it all pointed to something larger than a simple fling. I resolved to follow those crumbs wherever they led, no matter how deep or dark the trail became. Because once suspicion takes root, it doesn't let go. And I couldn't shake the image of her whispering into the phone in the dead of night, "Don't wake him." She hadn't meant me to hear it, but I had. And from that moment, nothing between us would ever be the same. The morning after I had seen her with the man at the cafe, I sat at the kitchen table staring into my coffee as she breezed around the apartment, humming under her breath. She had an ease about her, as though she had spent the evening buried in spreadsheets and conference calls rather than leaning across a cafe table with a stranger's hand in hers. When I asked casually if she'd finished her project, she nodded without hesitation, offering details about deadlines and demanding clients. Her voice carried a confidence that almost convinced me, almost. But the image of her laughing in that dim cafe replayed in my mind, sharper than anything she said now. I let her talk. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions. She seemed relieved when I didn't press further, almost too relieved. That afternoon, I checked our shared calendar again. Nothing had been updated. Not one trace of the project she had described in such detail. I cross-checked her company's website, scanning for press releases or scheduled meetings. There was nothing. The following days deepened the strangeness. She began locking her laptop whenever she left the room, a habit she had never bothered with before. Her phone never left her pocket or her hand. She stepped outside to take calls, her voice dropping to a low murmur. One night, I tested her. I told her I had forgotten something in her car and asked for the keys. She hesitated, a fraction of a second too long, then handed them over with a forced smile. I walked down to the parking lot, unlocked the car, and scanned the inside. On the passenger seat lay a receipt from a restaurant 2 towns over. Dated the night she claimed she was working late. The receipt listed 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, and a dessert. She had told me she was eating a sandwich at her desk. When I confronted her lightly, asking how her sandwich had been, she blinked before answering. Then she smiled too quickly and said it had been fine. I began noticing others around us picking up on things too. Her coworker, whom I ran into outside a coffee shop one morning, mentioned she hadn't been in the office as much lately. He assumed she was working from home or meeting clients elsewhere. His tone was casual, but it was another fracture in her story. Later, our neighbor Ruth, who often lingered in the building's lobby, mentioned she had seen my fiancé late one night stepping out of a cab with someone who wasn't me. Ruth's eyes narrowed as she related, but she didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. The walls were closing in. Piece by piece, her fabrications were unraveling. One evening, I tested her again. I mentioned that I might stop by her office the next day to bring her lunch. The reaction was immediate. Her smile faltered, her voice tightened. She told me she had back-to-back meetings and that it would be better if I didn't. Then she covered it with another smile, adding that she didn't want me to waste time. The defensiveness was too sharp, too telling. Later that night, she left her laptop charging while she showered. The screen glowed with an open email draft. I moved closer and saw only a fragment before the screen locked, but it was enough. The draft referenced a hotel reservation, not in her name, but linked to her personal email. My heart pounded. This wasn't just meetings at cafes. This was organized, deliberate. The contradictions began to weigh on me like stones in my pockets. Every explanation she offered only raised more questions. She said she had been on the phone with her cousin again, but her cousin posted on social media about being asleep in another time zone at that exact moment. She said she had been with a group of colleagues, but receipts, travel times, and the absence of any mention from her coworker proved otherwise. Her stories formed a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse with the smallest push. The turning point came one Thursday evening. She left the apartment dressed for what she claimed was another late shift. Minutes after she left, I logged into our shared bank account. A withdrawal had been made earlier that afternoon at an ATM across town. It wasn't a large sum, but it was strange. She never used that machine. I checked the history. Several similar withdrawals appeared over the past few weeks, always from the same location. I drove there. The ATM stood beside a small motel whose neon sign flickered weakly against the night. My stomach clenched. This wasn't coincidence. This was habit. I parked across the street and waited. An hour later, a familiar car pulled in. She stepped out, looking around nervously before disappearing inside. 15 minutes later, the tall man from the cafe arrived. He parked further away, glancing around like someone used to keeping secrets. He followed her through the same door. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. This was no longer suspicion. This was confirmation. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and stared into the dark. I felt anger rising in waves, but beneath it was something colder, clarity. Every lie she had told, every story she had woven, had collapsed under the weight of reality. The cousin calls, the late nights, the changed passwords, the restaurant receipts, the coworker's observations, the neighbor's casual remark, all threads pointing in one direction. But what gnawed at me most was not just the affair. It was the secrecy surrounding the money, the ATM withdrawals, the hotel reservations under her email. This wasn't only betrayal of loyalty. It was betrayal of trust, of finances, of our shared life. I realized then that if I wanted the truth, I needed to approach it not as a lover, not as someone scorned, but as an investigator. Evidence first, confrontation later. The next morning, I tested her one final time. Over breakfast, I mentioned that I had seen Ruth in the lobby. Her fork paused midair. I added that Ruth had been chatty, that she had mentioned seeing her late at night. My fiancée's face hardened before she forced a laugh, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. But her reaction said everything. Her mask had slipped for a fraction of a second, and behind it was panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of her walking into that motel, the man following close behind. The puzzle pieces were fitting together, but the picture they formed was darker than I had expected. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't just about infidelity. The money trail, the secrecy, the constant guarding of her devices. It hinted at something larger, something she didn't want me to discover. I told myself I would dig deeper, no matter where it led. Because the worst part of betrayal isn't the moment you discover it. It's the silence that follows, when you realize the person lying beside you every night has been building a world behind your back, brick by brick, hoping you never notice. But I had noticed, and I wasn't about to stop. I couldn't shake the image of her slipping into that motel. It gnawed at me during the day, followed me into restless dreams at night, and greeted me when I woke in the early hours. The evidence was already enough to confirm betrayal, but my instincts told me it didn't stop there. Something deeper was hiding under the surface. So I began to track patterns. I printed our joint bank account statements, highlighting every withdrawal from that same ATM across town. They were spaced evenly, almost every 4 days, and always in amounts small enough to avoid suspicion. 200 here, 300 there. Over a month, it added up to nearly 3,000. She had no reason to hide these transactions from me unless the destination was something I wasn't meant to see. I drove back to the motel during the day, parking across the street. It was a rundown building with peeling paint and a sign that flickered with missing letters. But it wasn't abandoned. Cars came and went in quiet rotation. The clerk behind the counter gave me a sharp look when I entered, his eyes narrowing as if he'd seen too many curious husbands before. When I asked casually if there were rooms available for the weekend, he slid the logbook across the counter. My eyes flicked over the entries. There it was, her email address, used to reserve a room 2 nights earlier. But something else leapt out at me. The reservation wasn't only in her name. It was paired with another. His name. Felix. That was the name I had seen flash across her phone in the living room at 3:15 a.m. I left the building with my pulse hammering. Seeing the 2 names together in black ink carried a weight that no suspicion ever could. This wasn't fleeting. This wasn't casual. This was deliberate, organized, planned. I spent the following week gathering more. If she thought she was careful, She underestimated me. When she left for work, I followed. She didn't notice the second car, keeping a steady distance. She drove to the same cafe, the same quiet motel, the same ATM. Once, I watched as she handed Felix an envelope outside the cafe, her eyes darting nervously. He counted quickly before slipping it into his jacket. It wasn't affection being exchanged. It was money. Questions tangled in my head. Who was this man? A simple lover wouldn't need envelopes of cash. A fling didn't require ATM withdrawals and calculated intervals. This was something else. One evening, after she returned home, I checked her bag while she showered. Tucked between receipts and cosmetics was a folded piece of paper. A hotel invoice. But the charge wasn't just for the room. It listed conference space and guest services. The total was far larger than any casual rendezvous should cost. My hands shook as I held it. She wasn't just meeting him for secret trysts. There was another layer, another arrangement, and it involved money moving in amounts far beyond what I had seen. I started digging into Felix. His name was uncommon enough to trace. Online searches pulled fragments. A freelance consultant with no permanent office, a history of working with small companies that often folded within months, and whispers on obscure forums about questionable dealings. He was the kind of man who knew how to move money without leaving fingerprints. The realization chilled me. This wasn't just about betrayal of love. It was betrayal of trust, of security. She wasn't simply cheating. She was entangling herself with someone who thrived in shadows, and by extension, dragging me into it too. The next break came unexpectedly. I was sorting through a stack of unopened mail when I found a credit card bill addressed to her. At the bottom of the statement, the charges screamed louder than words. Multiple transactions at the same hotel, restaurant bills in her name, but signed by someone else, and a jewelry store purchase I had never seen the results of. I laid the statement flat on the table and stared. Every charge was a breadcrumb, leading back to nights she had sworn she was buried in work. That evening, I asked about her day. She spun another story, this time about a late client call. Her words tumbled smoothly, as if she had rehearsed them. But in my pocket was the receipt for the necklace Felix had signed for. The duplicity was staggering. I decided to confirm the truth in person. On a Friday night, she claimed she was driving to a networking dinner. She left dressed elegantly, her perfume thick in the air. 10 minutes later, I followed. Her car turned away from downtown restaurants and corporate buildings, instead winding toward the outskirts. She parked outside the motel again. I pulled in half a block down, heart pounding. She stepped out, scanned the street, then disappeared inside. Minutes later, Felix arrived. This time, I couldn't stop myself. I slipped from my car, keeping to the shadows. I followed them into the lobby, careful not to draw attention. The clerk barely looked up. She and Felix moved down the hall, stopping at a door. They slipped inside. I approached, my ear against the thin wood. Voices carried faintly. His was sharp, commanding. Hers was softer, nervous. Words drifted through. Next transfer, deadline, he doesn't know. The blood in my veins turned cold. This wasn't infidelity alone. It was conspiracy. I pulled back, retreating down the hallway before I could be caught. My mind raced as I drove home. The affair was undeniable, but now it was tied to money, to transfers, to deadlines. She wasn't just cheating. She was participating in something far more dangerous. For days afterward, I said nothing. I needed clarity, not just suspicions and overheard fragments. I scoured bank statements, hotel logs, receipts, piecing together timelines. The picture that emerged was damning. The withdrawals weren't random. They aligned with hotel bookings, dinners, and payments in his name. She wasn't just giving him her time. She was funding him, supporting something she didn't want me to see. The final confirmation came from a chance encounter. I ran into Simon, my brother, at a small bar across town. Over a drink, I let slip that I suspected things weren't right at home. He studied me quietly before nodding. He told me he had once seen her with Felix, weeks earlier, at a gas station. He hadn't said anything then, assuming I knew him. They were too familiar, too close to be casual acquaintances. His words tightened the net around her. Even those on the outside were noticing. By now, my nights were restless vigils. I lay awake listening to the faint clicks of her phone, the muffled buzz of late-night messages, the soft footsteps as she slipped into the living room to whisper into the dark. Every answer I pursued only opened another secret. Every clue I uncovered revealed a larger scheme. And the deeper I went, the more I realized she wasn't just betraying me emotionally. She was betraying me financially, strategically, and perhaps even legally. I had enough to confront her. Enough to throw the evidence on the table and demand the truth. But I held back. Because if I moved too soon, she could twist the story, paint me as paranoid, claim it was all misunderstanding. No, I needed to wait. To gather everything. To make sure that when the truth exploded, there would be no escape for her. no lie left to hide behind. And so I planned, quietly, patiently, like a hunter tightening the circle around his prey. By the time the weekend arrived, the weight of evidence I had gathered could crush any denial. Bank statements, receipts, hotel records, overheard conversations. Each piece sharpened the blade I intended to use. But a simple confrontation in private would have been too easy for her. She could cry, deny, twist the story until I was the villain. I needed to expose her where lies could not survive. So I set the stage. I arranged a small dinner at our apartment, inviting Simon and Ruth under the pretense of celebrating a recent work milestone. She didn't suspect a thing. She greeted them warmly, poured wine, played the perfect hostess. The irony was suffocating. As we ate, conversation flowed easily. She laughed, leaned in close to me, placed her hand on mine as though our relationship was unshakable. I waited until the table had quieted, until glasses were half empty and comfort had settled in. Then I spoke. I have something to show everyone. I pulled out a folder I had prepared. Inside were the printed bank statements, receipts, hotel invoices, all neatly organized. I laid them on the table one by one. Her smile froze. The first page showed the ATM withdrawals. The second, the motel reservation with her email beside Felix's name. The third, the jewelry store receipt signed under her account but collected by him. Each sheet was a stone, and together they formed a wall closing in around her. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Simon stared silently, recognizing the man's name from his own encounter. Ruth leaned back, her eyes wide but unsurprised, as though she had suspected all along. Finally, she found her voice. She tried to laugh, to dismiss it as coincidence, as misunderstanding. But the weight of evidence was too much. Her excuses cracked like brittle glass. I didn't raise my voice. Calm precision was deadlier than rage. I explained how I had followed her, how I had seen her hand Felix envelopes of cash, how I had overheard them whispering about transfers and deadlines. The more I spoke, the smaller she seemed, cornered by a truth too heavy to escape. Then came the moment that broke her mask completely. I slid one final paper across the table, the hotel invoice listing not only rooms, but conference space. I looked her in the eyes and asked what she and Felix had been planning. Her composure collapsed. Tears spilled, but they carried no weight with me. She stammered about being pressured, about debts, about Felix promising her a way out if she helped him. She admitted she had used our shared account to funnel money, that she had lied to cover her tracks. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was financial fraud, plain and simple. The room was silent. Simon's jaw tightened, his disappointment visible. Ruth shook her head slowly, muttering under her breath. And my fiancée, the woman I had once trusted with my life, sat trembling, exposed, her carefully constructed lies crumbling around her. I told her calmly that the bank had already been notified, that I had reported the suspicious activity, handed over copies of the receipts, and given them Felix's name. Her eyes widened in panic. She hadn't realized how far ahead I was. I reminded her of the night I had overheard her say, "Don't wake him." I told her I hadn't forgotten, and that single sentence had been the spark that led me to uncover everything. Her begging began then. She pleaded that it hadn't meant anything, that she had been desperate, that she still loved me. But love doesn't drain bank accounts in secret. Love doesn't share hotel rooms with a man who handles envelopes of cash. I stood, gathered the papers, and told her it was over. The fallout came swiftly. Within a week, the bank froze the joint account. Investigators contacted me for further details. I handed them everything. The receipts, the dates, the conversations I had recorded on my phone. Felix's name became a red flag in their system, tied to other suspicious activities across town. For her, the walls closed quickly. Without access to our finances, she couldn't continue. Felix vanished the moment pressure mounted, leaving her with nothing but debt and a ruined reputation. She called me dozens of times, her voice desperate in every voicemail. I didn't answer. Simon stood by me through the process, his quiet support a reminder that not everyone close to me lived behind masks. Ruth, too, gave her statement willingly, confirming what she had seen. My fiancée, once so careful, so secretive, now found herself alone, stripped of allies and resources. The final time I saw her was outside the apartment building weeks later. She looked thinner, her face pale, her voice shaking. She begged me to give her another chance, to believe she had been manipulated, that Felix had trapped her. But by then, the truth was carved too deeply. Trust, once shattered, doesn't rebuild with words. I told her calmly that I wished her luck, but that our lives no longer intersected. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the cold night air, clutching her phone like it could save her. The consequences rippled far beyond us. Felix's name surfaced in local news tied to fraudulent consulting schemes. Authorities were investigating, and though she wasn't charged immediately, her involvement meant she was questioned, her reputation shredded. She lost her job within a month. As for me, I cut all ties. I closed the joint accounts, changed the locks, rebuilt my life brick by brick without her shadow looming over it. The whisper I had overheard at 3:15 a.m., "Don't wake him," became the thread that unraveled everything. It had seemed small at the time, almost insignificant, but it was the seed of discovery, the moment that cracked the mask wide open. And in the end, she was the one left begging while I walked away free. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.